Hello, and thank you for joining us today, and welcome to this Hasselblad webinar. I hope you're all keeping safe in these tough times and are looking forward to spending the next hour with us. I'm Mark Whitney, part of Hasselblad's European marketing team, and I'm keeping safe and following government guidelines by coming to you today from my home in the UK. I'm also joined by my colleague, Chris Cooze, who is Hasselblad's Global Technical Communications Manager. And today's webinar is the first in a new series, which we are calling Phocus Q&A webinars. The Phocus Q&A webinars are designed to be driven by you, the audience. To be held on a regular basis, you are able to suggest a question or topic for us to cover during the webinar as part of your registration process. And we'll select the most requested or relevant topics for Chris to then cover during the webinar. So just before we get started, please let me go through just some of the usual slides. So just to let everyone know that the webinar is being recorded, and a recording will be posted up on the Hasselblad YouTube channel following the webinar. It will be worst case tomorrow morning or maybe later tonight. And you can also find all of Hasselblad's previous webinars on there as well from recent months. Also, a quick shout out for the Hasselblad Masters. Hasselblad Masters is still open for entries until the end of July. If you'd wish to enter, you can go to the Hasselblad website and the full URL on the page there. Closing date, as I say, end of July. You don't have to use a Hasselblad camera in order to enter. So any camera of 16 megapixels and above and fitting the device requirements can enter. So if you look at the full rules and regulations on our website for more details on that, and we look forward to receiving your submissions. So just to go through today, so as I say, new format. These are suggestions that have been suggested by the audience when you registered. So we're looking to cover as many as possible. So what we've got today is the import process, and we had quite a few questions and suggestions to that. So from David, Key, Ramona, Nicholas, Janelle, Larry, John, Chris, Laurie, all based in the US, Geraldo in Brazil, Robert in the Philippines, Jeffrey in Canada, Dean in the UK, Gary from Qatar, Andreas in Austria, and Antonio in Italy. Thanks all for your suggestions. So we're going to look to cover the import process. That will include raw formats, the FreeFR and FFF file formats that Hasselblad support and the differences between them. Import locations for when you're both tethered and importing from an SD card. Applying presets during the import, and also exporting and how the export can affect then importing into other third-party software. And then we've also got support for third-party files. Again, this was a topic suggested by numerous people, but mainly George in Switzerland, Charles in Belgium, Valen in Malaysia, Victor in the US, Matthias in Germany, and Rolf in Switzerland. So Chris is going to be covering the difference between the Windows and Mac versions of Phocus for third-party support, and also the available tools and functions for these files. Next, we've got local corrections and using adjustment layers. So this was suggested by Andre and Greg from the US, Alessandro from Italy, and many others as well, sort of there or thereabouts that relating to it. So yeah, Chris is going to show how you can color correct and locate that to a certain part of the file. And then finally, negative reproduction mode. So we covered reproduction mode recently on another webinar, but for this question that was submitted by Peter in Belgium and also Boris in Slovakia, we're going to look at reproduction mode a little bit more and concentrate on the negative response. So taking a picture of a negative slide and then converting it to positive. So we estimate the running time to be about 40 minutes, could be a little bit longer. And then we've got Q&A hopefully at the end. Just to note on the Q&A, it's slightly different to usual. Please only submit questions if they're relating to today's topics. Any questions on topics that aren't included in today's agenda, please save that to for a further Phocus Q&A session. Maybe submit that for the next one, or or contact us for more information. So let's say hi to Chris. There we go.
Thank you. Okay, hi everyone. So we're going to take a look at the import process first. So as you may or may not know, basically Hasselblad cameras produce two different types of raw file. Depending on how your camera is connected or how you're shooting, if you're shooting to media card, the camera will produce a 3FR file, which is generally compressed so that we can get the maximum number of shots onto your SD card or CFast card, depending on which camera you're using. The second type is the 3F file. This is created when we are tethered to the computer. No restrictions in terms of compression, etc. there, and it speeds up the process in terms of import as the file is transferred to the computer for you to view. And we'll look at that in some detail actually in Phocus once we've quickly gone through a few slides. So in terms of the process, generally if I'm shooting 3F, i.e. tethered, then as I capture images with the camera, they come down the USB cable or firewire cable, basically into the computer. Phocus is running, and Phocus will immediately show a preview image for you to see. And you've probably noticed a fraction of a second later within the software, it'll pop. So this is where additional corrections are being added automatically, and basically the 3FR file from the camera is being converted automatically to a 3F file for storage on the computer. So automatically converted to the 3F, saved at your chosen capture location, and from then on basically you're into the editing process as you wish, and once you finish that, obviously then you export. From a 3FR point of view, when I'm shooting to media card without being connected to my computer, all the files then need to be imported from that SD card, and you can do that either through the camera, connecting that up and using the camera as a card reader, or through a card reader by inserting the SD card. Once you go through the import process, choosing the location and the presets, etc., that you're going to add, then it's automatically then converted to a 3F file and saved on the hard disk. Once you've got that converted file, you no longer need the 3FR file, which is actually in the SD card, the original capture from the camera, because effectively you now have a converted file, so you can get rid of that 3FR. And from then on, it's the same as above. Basically, files on the hard disk, you then edit and export. So just to add a little bit more detail for those that want it, effectively when you capture an image in the camera, the sensor values are converted through the 16-bit converter. We then apply all of the calibration type biases and so on, linearize the output, but that's pretty much it that's going on in the camera. Obviously, there's a small preview generated, which is what you're looking at on the back of the camera when you're doing a preview. And obviously, if you choose to shoot JPEG in the camera, then there's additional processes that make it a finished file that has to be carried out in the camera. But for today, we're going to concentrate on talking about the RAW. So the second part, in this case, if we were taking the files from the camera card, we take the 3F file, and when we import it into Phocus, additional functions are then carried out. So things like lens corrections, the underlying noise reduction, the ISO gain to the actual sensor signal, and the basic underlying corrections that we would normally add to any image are added. Now, when you're shooting tethered, automatically the output from the camera is fed down through the cable into Phocus, and it automatically does this. So there's no two-step process. And from then on, whichever one you're working on, it's already then at a 3F situation. And then we finish off converting the images through to the Hasselblad natural color solution. So our working color space. And obviously then finally, you work on the image within Phocus to do the editing, adjustment layers, etc., and then output that to your chosen file format, TIFFs, PSDs, etc. So there's quite a few operations that go on, but the most important ones really are at the start. If you're shooting to media card in camera, we try and keep the amount of processing down to a minimum to allow fast processing of the file and storage on the card, so that the actual camera is ready very quickly to carry on for the next shot. Obviously shooting tethered, that image isn't being stored. It can be handed over to the computer very quickly to be stored on the hard disk there. So we can get the computer that you're connected to do a lot of the hard work and processing. So we've had queries about how does that work then when we're using non-Hasselblad Phocus. So if I'm using Camera Raw or Lightroom, very similar, to be brutally honest. So if we take the 3FR file, so my camera SD card's got my files on, you connect to Lightroom, you do an import process, and basically Lightroom will copy the files to your chosen location. It will save them as a 3FR, so it doesn't do a conversion, but within its catalog, it stores what file it is. It works out automatically what lenses for lens corrections, and obviously you have to switch the corrections on. But all of that is done, and the data is then stored in the catalog, or if you tell it to do so, an XML file, which is a separate file to it. And then obviously you carry on and edit. 3F file, so if I was shooting tethered or importing 3F files that I've already converted maybe in Phocus, Lightroom and Camera Raw can deal with them direct. And again, the imported files are then saved in your chosen location. Very, very simple. It remembers where they are. And then you just carry on with the edit and export process. So the main difference there is Lightroom can handle either. It doesn't need to do a two-step. But for us, in terms of our workflow and speed of workflow, we stick to the two raw stages. So back into Phocus. Now, Phocus, we don't use a catalog to remember where all the files are. Effectively, if you're on a Mac, you'll access the files in the same way as you would access the Finder. If you're on a PC, you access the files in the same way as if you were using Windows Explorer. That makes it really easy, because if you have an existing file structure that you use for your shoots, maybe date, location, and so on, you can just copy the files directly to the location that makes sense for your workflow. So once you install Phocus, the default is always Phocus captures. Okay. During the import process, you can change that, and we'll look at that as we go through the system. Media card, again, once you connect, the media card will show, and you can import the files again to your chosen location, either via the Finder-like interface, and we'll do this actually when we're live in Phocus. And then you can copy the files in, and Phocus will access those files from that given location. Obviously, you've normally got favorite folders, so maybe just like me here, a picture folder which has got all of your most used files in, or if you want to be more specific, you can set up multiple favorites. Or obviously you've got access to the normal file structure. So in this case, I had my normal computer hard disk, but I had an external SSD drive plugged in, so I could then access that just like I would any attached device in the Finder or Windows Explorer type view. So we try to make it as quick and simple as possible, as long as you have a location and a workflow format for your images where you store them. Phocus will just slot into that very, very simply. Additionally, as part of the capture process, and we'll look at this and create one, you can put in basic contact data, copyright information. In this case, I've chosen some basic company information here for me, but additionally down here you can see keywords, and you can make many sets of these. It could be subject specific, could be, in my case, camera product specific. You can break them down into sets, or in this case, all keywords could be listed and you just pick from them. You just select the keyword you want to use, and it will automatically add it to that file's keywords. So very, very straightforward. And obviously that data is stored either through the capture process or the import process, depending on which way you're working. And it's actually in the header information. And in fact, that's one of the biggest differences between working in Phocus and working with files in another application. All corrections within Phocus are stored within the header of the file. We don't use an external XML file, and obviously there's no catalog. And that can lead to issues which we'll talk about a bit later on, in terms of if you spend a lot of time correcting files in Phocus, Phocus can access the corrections for the raw file, but unfortunately, pretty much everything else can't read that information. So you're then forced to export the file as a 16-bit TIFF or a PSD to have a converted image that the other applications can then use. But we'll look at that in a little while. Exporting. Now, the export function actually is quite expandable, to be honest. By default, obviously, the basic presets are in there. So things like a JPEG, a TIFF, a PSD file, and a DNG are in there by default, and they're marked because they're locked with a Hasselblad H. But you have the option to hit the plus and create your own. And then you can choose from the file formats and so on. And we will do this in a short while. We'll work through this. One of the main questions we get asked is, how do I keep the Hasselblad color from Phocus? And then when I move to a third party or Photoshop, Lightroom, etc., how do I keep the Hasselblad color space and color control? The simplest method is to basically export your file and choose an output profile as source. That will embed the Hasselblad RGB or Hasselblad L-Star RGB profile in the file. Then when I open it in, say, Photoshop, I will normally get an alarm saying, this profile doesn't match your normal working space. What do you want to do? And at that point, you select to continue with the embedded, and that will effectively allow you to work within Hasselblad RGB within Photoshop. Again, we'll look at that when we create some profiles. So non-Hasselblad raw files. Our support for additional raw files is effectively that supplied in the Mac operating system. So your Canons, your Nikons, your Sonys, etc., all of those are supported within the OS, and we can then read those raw files using that and allow you to make some controlled edits. In addition to that, you've got your TIFF, PSD, and JPEG files, which again can all be edited within Phocus, Mac or PC version. But the important thing here is the third-party raw files are supported by the Macintosh OS, which is why, if you're using a PC, there is no additional raw format support. It's just Hasselblad. Obviously, if I'm trying to correct, in this case, I was correcting some of my old Canon files, I have a limitation in terms of what tools and what fine detail within the tools is available. So I've got my basic controls here for exposure, white balance, sharpness, curves, that type of thing. Even the global tools like defringe, keystone, film grade, all of those will still work. But where we want those fine control tools like clarity, shadow control, recovery, those are not available for third party, unfortunately. In terms of local corrections, we will look at this shortly in a live situation, but basically adjustment layers, you can have as many as your computer can actually support in terms of memory and usefulness, but I've had 5, 10 layers onto an image, no problem at all. So each layer then gives you the option of this expanding range of tools, and you can actually select 3 ways of applying the corrections. Now, for fine detail, obviously you're going to use the brush, and obviously you've got control of size and sharpness of edge, etc. but then you've got a linear and a circular gradient for doing larger areas more quickly. In terms of color adjustments, obviously we have a global saturation and vibrancy control, but 9 times out of 10, we want to do a more controlled adjustment of a particular color range. So in that case, we can use the dropper tool. Now, once I click on the image, click the dropper tool, click on my image, I will get a dot appear to tell me what that particular spot color I've selected is. You can then adjust the range over which that correction we're about to make is going to be applied. So if I click this line and drag it closer, it will narrow down the range that my correction here is going to apply, or if I want a wider color range, I can just drag it wider. And then I can adjust the hue, saturation, lightness, etc. to my requirement. And you can do multiple colors. So once you've corrected that, if there's another spot color, I can click somewhere else and I'll get another spot appear, and the same applies, I can correct. So one of the questions that came in was, what would be the sort of workflow that I would need to follow if I'm using current Hasselblad digital camera to copy negatives, slides, etc. To create a digital format? So in general, you're going to need some kind of additional hardware so that you can get close to that negative. Now that could be close-up filters onto the lenses that you've got. It could be extension tubes. There's a few third-party manufacturers now that make them for the X system, and obviously H system has its own set of 3. It could be a basic digitizing adapter that attaches to the front of an existing lens. Most people obviously will start with a macro lens and then add to that as required. So the standard XED macro lens will get you as 1:2 ratio. If you're using a H system, obviously you can use the 120 macro, which gives you 1:1. So in terms of processing that by Phocus software, we need to use reproduction mode, which, as you'll see, is not enabled by default generally. So if it's not already, you need to switch that on, and I'll show you how to do that. And then once you have reproduction mode, we need to go into the response section. Normally standard is the default, and we need to choose negative, which will then invert if it's obviously a negative color or black and white that I'm working with, and effectively it will apply a reverse linear curve to that, and I'll show you that in a while. We've got some negatives to work on. Once you've got that converted, you can then process with the rest of the tools in Phocus as you would normally do, and then obviously export when completed. So this one is pretty much the best way to show you is live, as opposed to try and explain it. So I'll show you that live. When you're doing things like this, the best way really is to save the corrections that you work out as a preset. So next time you then copy, say, a black and white negative, maybe FP4 or whatever, you've got a setting there which will automatically apply the negative reproduction mode plus any other general corrections that you would normally use to bring that up into a working file. And so you save yourself a lot of time and effort basically on that. So these are the items that we're going to spend some time now going through live, but it was just useful to go through a few things first through the presentation. So I shall now just quickly switch to Phocus. So hopefully you can all see that. Okay. So I'm going to look at how do we import files in both of the methods that we talked about. So firstly, I'll do the simpler one, which is importing from a media card. So basically I've got my SD card here and I've got my standard card reader attached to my Mac. just going to plug in the SD card, and hopefully that will appear down here. And there we go. So it's automatically opened up the thumbnails of the card here. If I wanted to, if there was an awful lot of files on my card, I could go to the top of Focus up here and switch off the main window. That will then give you a thumbnails only view. Alternatively, if you click the layouts button, you have a thumbnails only mode automatically set up for you. Now, the reason why I've gone to thumbnails only is because as a 3FR, I just click the main window back on, I can click on any file, and as you see, there is no large preview. It's not been created yet. I've just got the small, effectively the thumbnail that's created for you to view on the back of the camera. And to move on, we now need to import those files. So they're sitting on my SD card here. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to import them to a location on my computer. So again, I'm just going to switch off the large viewer, and I'm going to select all files. Import becomes available here. If I now click import, we've got all of the settings that we need to import the files and apply various presets. So as a minimum, if we look here for the destination, I'm going to choose a different file size. So in my webinar files, I am going to create a new folder. Obviously, you would use something that's far more useful to you in terms of date, time, or something pertinent to the shoot name. But for today, I'm just going to do SD import, choose, and then the adjustment. If you have presets for different types of setups, you can apply them here. We have some basics from Hasselblad there, and obviously you can see I've got a few here. And all they are would be settings that work every time for your file. So it could be that I want the lens corrections on, I automatically want a +1 on the exposure, and I want some additional sharpness and so on. Something very specific to the way that you shoot. You can save that as a preset, and I'll show you that in a while. And here is where you would then apply it to all of the files in one go as you import them. You've then got your metadata, which we'll look at in a while, which is basically, as I said earlier, your contact information, copyright information, and so on. And then you have, how do you want this particular set of files to be renamed? Because obviously at the moment, all we've got is the shooting order number, basically, which may be fine, but normally you'd want something quite specific. So various options are in here. So name, raw sequence, or just name and sequence, which will then automatically just count up file 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Or a date and job sequence. So if I do date and job sequence, it then takes the job name and puts that after the date. So in this case, that's now been updated so that you can see SD card. And that's all I'm going to do. I'm asking it to sequence from 1 because the files do go from 1 to 3, etc. So that works for me. If you have a particular number sequence you want to use, you can actually change the first file number. And then we click import. So it shouldn't take too long. Another 3 or 4. The actual process down in the bottom left-hand corner tells you how many are left to go. Okay, so the folder that I created is now part of my 3.6 webinar file. So there's my SD card. And if I switch this back on now, I now have the large preview. Okay, so that's the basic import from SD card. Very, very simple. Just you choose where you want the files copied to. How do you want to name them? How do you want to number them? And do you want to add any basic correction or setup to them automatically? If not, you just leave it as standard and choose the file numbering solution, and away you go. Or copy those files, create FFF files, and copy them to the chosen location on your hard disk. Okay, so that is a very basic SD card import. So I'm just going to eject my SD card. Now, if I'm shooting tethered, I need to start in the capture tab. I just need to connect the camera so that we actually can have full control. Okay. Takes a few seconds, but the camera should automatically appear up here. There we go. Okay, so it's now seeing my Hasselblad X1D, and full camera control is here. So ISO, aperture, shutter speed, etc., even control of the autofocus. Okay, so it's good. We've got the camera connected here. If you're using X1D 2 907X and you have trouble, it won't connect to the camera. One thing to check, just make sure that in the connectivity option on the camera that you're not set up for iOS connection. So especially if you're using Focus Mobile 2 connected to your iPad, iPhone, just make sure when you tether to your computer to shoot that way, you need to make sure it says Mac or PC OS. Okay. So then for your standard tethered shooting job, what you would need to do is then within the job info, here is the destination folder. So just like we did with the SD card, I need to choose where are my images going to go. So in this case, I can go back into here, 3.6 webinar, I'll create a new folder and say tethered test. Obviously, you would create your folder with the name, and specifics of the shoot would be the best way, so you know the date, the shoot, and any other information in the folder name. So that's created. We choose that, and now you'll notice that it's destination over here, but also top left, you've got tethered test as our listed capture destination. Please note, every time you shoot tethered, you need to check that, because otherwise it will put all tethered shots into this folder. It will always remember this last folder, and you need to make sure it's correct for each shoot that you make. Back over to the job info, you can give it a name. So in this case, I could say tether captures. That would be easier. So very straightforward, and you can choose whatever sequence, exactly the same as the import sequence through SD card. So it could be date and sequence or job and sequence. And then choose your starting number. So in this case, I could say frame 1. There. So as you can see, each frame will now be captured as tethered captures, 1, 2, 3, etc. And again, metadata, contact information. You can choose whichever you need, whatever you set up, and away you go. You've then got obviously basic controls for white balance, exposure, etc. And if you needed to, if you're doing focus bracketing and so on, you've got the capture sequencer automatically set there. If you feel you need additional tools, all you need to do is access the tool set and switch on the ones you feel you need. As you're shooting with a tethered capture, it will automatically apply the last used set of corrections to the next shot. So that's one to bear in mind if you're just testing out what a few different views look like and still shooting, it will keep adding those to the next batch. Okay. Moving on. So in terms of the actual tethered capture, I'm just going to take a couple of basic shots. And unfortunately, I am working from my living room, so the range of options I have to show you is quite limited, I'm afraid. So I've just taken a picture. I think shutter speed needs to be a bit higher. And maybe a little bit. Okay. And it's as simple as that. As you see, each of the captures, as I take a picture, they come in, the preview is made, and they're automatically turned into 3FRs, sorry, 3F files. I don't have that intermediate stage. Okay. Okay. Now, in terms of the metadata that we were talking about, or the IPTC data, if I go to the Browse tab, by default here, you automatically have information about camera, lens, resolution, time, date, etc., and the serial number of the camera. That's default information that's encoded into the file. But you then have this identifier data, which could be various amounts. So I can have a large amount of information in there in terms of copyright, etc. I could keep it very, very small, literally just have my contact information. It's quite useful to know your name's encoded in it, your contact data, and so on, so that you can trace your files in case you think they're being used where they shouldn't be. Additionally, we looked at keywords. So here I can create different sets, and obviously if I click edit, I can create a new set or add new keywords. So in this case, I can click add, and I could put a new keyword in. Click OK, and that becomes part of my test set. Or obviously, if I go to all keywords, everything shows. As time goes by, that'll build up in terms of a range of words and phrases in there that are relevant to your type of work. So it will get easier and quicker for you to then add those keyword search words. Okay. Let's move on from that. Okay. So once I have my files and I'm happy with them in the actual computer, so if I go to the SD card import that we did, okay, pictures, SD card. There's one of my files. Okay. So all we've done is literally do the basics and import it. So here's my basic histogram, my exposure tool, curves, etc. And so now what we need to do is make sure that all of the basics are done. So in this case, if we look, dust remove, sorry, that was my. Lens corrections here. if you saw the previous webinar, you've seen that we've added the adaptive option here for chromatic aberration, which is pretty good. Please watch the previous webinar for a full coverage of that. Distortion and vignetting automatically applied. We just need to make sure the tool is switched on. Let's just get a bit of dust. Okay, everything else is on. So the curves are flat. White balance by default is as shot. Now, very, very quick workflow here. We would then do basic corrections. So I'm going to hit an update for white balance there. When you were then happy, you could then move on and export. But before we hit the export process, I'm going to go through some of the adjustment layer tools and so on, just so that you can be happy with that. So if you give me 1 second, I will just float the adjustment layers. Hitting the plus tool creates your first layer. And then here's your correction. So in this case, I'm going to apply an EV correction. So I want to increase by say 0.7 of a stop. And then I now choose how do I want this. So in this case, it's going to be a brush. I can choose the size, the flow, and obviously the feathered amount. To be able to see where you're actually painting the correction, if you switch on this item, it'll show you a mask as you paint. So for a very, very quick, obviously you would take a lot more time than I am on this. Just very quickly fill that in. So I know the area that I'm working to. Turn off the mask, and now as I apply my correction, you can actually adjust it to your needs. And as I said, you can add more corrections. If I just up that one, I can now hit a second layer and I've got the same level of correction again, and I can apply something else. So it could be, I want to open up the shadows. So again, I would then go over the area that I want. Just very, very quickly there. And again, if I just show you that you can adjust that up or down as you want. So basic corrections, this is a more local type correction, very quick and easy to do. Just close that. And then as we talked about, color correction. So let me just select a file, which is a little bit, let's look at the stained glass windows. So in this case now, I'm just going to open up the amount a little bit and do a bit of recovery on the windows for the highlights. And now I can choose the color that I want to correct. So in this case, it may be that I want to change just the green areas in this. So select the green, there's my dot. I can increase or decrease the range that I want it to be, and then apply here. So I can just, I'll do a large correction so that you can see. And just push the saturation. So as you can see, that's quite overpowering. If I then drop that right off, we should see a change. If I zoom in, it'll make that a lot easier. %. Okay. Maybe a better file. Sorry about that. As you can see, so now that's pushed the green correction well over. If you don't want a particular correction, click on the dot and click delete, and it goes back to normal. Double clicking a correction on a slider will push it back to 0. Okay. So that's your adjustment layers, your color correction tool. Obviously, global corrections like curves and so on work in exactly the same way as you've just seen me there with the color correction tool. You can apply a standard curve, etc. to global image, as you are all well aware of. So then moving on to export. So if I click on the image that we corrected a little while earlier, I now want to export this file. I can use the presets, no problem at all. So if I go to the output preview, if I just float this tool, it'll be a lot easier. So my defaults, I've added a personal one, a profile one, etc. But you can create your own. So obviously the presets from Hasselblad are in here in terms of TIFF16, grayscale and so on, PSD2, layers, PSD and JPEGs. They're the defaults. But if I hit edit, I will automatically then come to the preset screen, and all I need to do is hit the plus. I can then create, if I say new JPEG, and then I can select my file type, quality level, pixels per inch, but more interestingly inside here, you will then have your control. Do you want the full image? Do you want just a very quick preview? Do you want it scaled? Or do you want a specific pixel size? All of those then bring up additional windows for you to fill in, which will then control. So I could say 50% of the original. And then here is your output profile. So if you're going to be using the image for, say, general web use, you would then select something like sRGB, so you will have no color issues with that. Or if you're then going to further go on and edit it in, say, Photoshop or so on, if you were to select source, that keeps it within the Hasselblad color space, keeps that embedded inside for you to be able to access that within Photoshop, etc. And then hit OK. That then becomes a new item on your drop-down menu. Once you're happy with that, you can then export your file. Hitting export brings up this new window. And so first option is to select where do you want them. So as it's just a test today, I'm going to choose desktop. Actually, let's put it into pictures, webinar in there. Then you can select your option. So I'm just going to select my new JPEG that I've just created. And here again, you've got an option. How do you want this file named? You know, if you've got 50 files that you're wanting to export, you might want to rename them something specific. And here's where you can do that. And then once you're happy, click export. You'll notice there's this additional output option here. You can get it to do a second set. So I could be creating a small preview here, and I could be exporting a full-size TIFF 16-bit here. Additionally, from this menu, you can get the file to be shown in your output location, or you can open the file automatically in your chosen editor. So in that case, for me, I have Photoshop as my chosen editor. It would then export the file and transfer it automatically to Photoshop. So I'm just going to hit export. And that will then count. I have one export happening here. Now, obviously, I only selected one file there, but I could have selected all the files in the folder and done exactly the same. Hit export. It would then renumber and rename and output all of the files that you've selected. And exporting it is pretty much as simple as that. Okay. So bear with me. This is a Canon CR2 file. So as we discussed earlier about what tools are available and what's the limitations, if I now go to my basic tools here over on the adjustment tab, you can see, you know, the histogram is still available, your exposure tool is here, but as we discussed, your recovery, your shadow fill and so on is not available. White balance obviously is. Sharpness controls, unfortunately, adjustment layers are not. Curves are, color correction, grayscale, obviously lens correction, scene calibration, that type of in-depth tool are not supported. That's only for Hasselblad RAW, I'm afraid. But film grain, keystone and color, obviously those tools are fully supported. Okay. The same would apply if I am accessing a JPEG file. So we've just, if I go to my files, there's my export. And as you can see, it's showing as SD export 03. So there's the file. And again, in terms of tools for editing a JPEG, the limitation here is because it's not a raw file, I can't access the recovery and shadow. But things like curves, white balance corrections, keystone and so on, all of that will still work on a non-raw file. Okay. Let's just move to there. So one of the other questions that we received through the system was basically the cropping tool, issues with the cropping tool and the orientation tool. So I'm going to go to my default tools here very quickly, show you the crop and orientation tool. If I just quickly select an image, now by default the ratio here is none. So if I was to turn on the crop tool, I can then, you can see this particular file already has a crop, but there's, let me click out of that. I can then select an unbounded area. It's up to me if I want a square, if I want a long rectangle, I choose, okay. This is an interesting file. So this particular image, as you can see, has been corrected in the keystone correction. That's why it's such a weird image. You can then re-edit the crop area of a keystone to incorporate areas that may be just outside the image that weren't kept. And you can then move the crop box around to suit. Now that's great for a freeform correction, but for most people, they're going to want to keep a specific ratio. So if we look here, your standard ones are built in, but once again, if you hit create preset, you can give it a name and set your proportions, your ratio that you're after, and then basically that will be added to your list. But by default, the tool will show none. You've also got your rotation tool here, so you can straighten an image manually or rotate an image manually. Alternatively, you can use the line tool to basically draw a line where you feel it should be either vertical or horizontal. So in this particular case, if I was to very quickly just draw a line there, it's pretty much got a small correction there in it, just to make it make a correction for you. There you go. There. Okay. Right, so that's the vast majority of what we talked about covered, leaving us one more, which is basically the how do I work with negatives or slides. So here's some real basic scans of some color and black and white negatives that I did. So I'm just going to select a frame. So this was a quick capture of a 645 negative. in the adjust menu, you can see here, I've got Reproduction Tool on as by default, but if it's not showing, again, go to your tool set and just choose the Reproduction Tool. Okay, so mine's switched on by default. As we discussed, we're then looking at your working space, so that could be RGB or L-star RGB. Your color calibrations and so on, leave them at factory unless you've made a specific color profile. That was covered in previous webinars. And here we have that response. So I'm going to select negative, and automatically I get a positive image in this case because that's what I'm after. And now I can adjust the image in exactly the same way that I would. So I can open it up. I can select a white balance area. So again, use the dropper tool and say probably that's more gray. And then adjust the exposure. The only thing you need to remember, obviously, when you're using negative, some of the corrections work reverse. So in this case, if I make the exposure value higher, it gets darker, lower, gets lighter. And then I can play with the contrast and so on. So once you've got it to that stage, you can then adjust your image as you wish, and the same way that you could play with your curves and so on. And then once you're happy with that, maybe a little extra sharpness because it is a copy. And then we're done. And basically, I can then export that as it would just a normal file. So in this case, hit export. I'm going to use a standard TIFF in this case, and then just hit export. Okay. Right, Mark, I think that's probably pretty much everything there.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Hopefully you can all hear me now. Apologies for earlier. I read from the comments that there was maybe a loss in sound, so not quite sure what happened there, but hopefully it's all good now. Yeah, I've got one question for you from Gary.
Okay.
With regards to what's your advice for backing up files, and is it possible to save files to the SD card as well as tethering to Phocus desktop?
By default, if you're tethered, it will only save onto the computer, not into the camera at the same time. That is a request that's been put in. And obviously, if you're shooting to Phocus Mobile 2, that is now an option to have dual on there. But within Phocus Desktop, currently, if you're tethered, it's only computer. To be honest, at that point, most people probably make an automatic backup anyway, copy the files, get them imported onto the system, and then their backup will automatically create a backup file for them.
Okay. Then another quick question we're going to answer from the suggested topics that we had.
Okay.
It was from both John and Ron, both based in the US.
Okay.
Just quickly, the batch editing. How do you make a correction to one image and then apply that to multiple images automatically? Can you show us that quickly?
Yeah, can do that very, very quickly. So let's say this particular image here, I want it to make it a little bit lighter and possibly, let's say, a little bit more sharpness. And let's say I want to improve the saturation a little bit. Now I've made 3 corrections there. And if I go to the adjustment browser and click current, it shows me those 3 corrections here. If I want to correct all of the rest of the images with all of those corrections, that's very simple. All I need to do there is to effectively select all of the images that I want. I'm just going to make those a bit smaller. Bear with me 1 second. Just makes life a little bit easier. So that's the image I'm working from. I select the rest of the images that I want and I hit modify. This shows me every possible correction that I can copy across, and you might want to do everything, or in this case, I just want to do what I've selected here. So I can click sharpness, exposure, and color correction. And then I click modify. Then that will copy all of those 3 corrections to all of those files in one go. Okay. Now that might be a crop, maybe imagine you shooting a load of landscapes and something's a little bit off. You think, oh no, I need to straighten every file up. You do the first one and then you copy that. But it may be that actually you only want to copy one correction. You might have half a dozen other corrections, but actually on your main file, it may be that you just want one correction copied across. So for instance, if I wanted the curves adjusted, and I've got all of these other corrections, but I only want the curve applied to everything else, what I can do within curves, you can then choose this option, modify curves of selected files. So now I can select from this file, I can go and say, actually, I only want to apply that to these files. And now modify curves of selected files. And that's copied the curve correction to those 3 files and only the curve correction. So that's your 2 methods, basically, every part that you've corrected or just a specific tool. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, and then another quick question from Mark. Is it possible to create variations of the same image?
Yes.
So can you duplicate a file?
Yeah, so instead of having virtual copies effectively, I can have, so if I just quickly show you a file that I've got here, this is the finished image, but actually if I hit here, this is the history effectively, okay? And so I can go back to any point, but more usefully, I can go here, and if I was to make a big change, so let's say I want to turn this into a grayscale image, and then boost the contrast a little bit. If I then hit save here, it saves as this item, which is okay, but it doesn't really help you in 3 weeks' time. You don't know what it is. But if you now come to here, you can rename the actual adjustments that you've just saved. So if I was to go to the last one here, which is what we just did, click on it, I can say grayscale or whatever I want to call it. And that is what here sits there. So I could give it a name, and then I can go back to my previous color one. I can change it, export it, do what I want, but I think, oh, well, actually, I did like that grayscale. Just do that, and it will load those corrections, and away you go. So that's the equivalent that we have for virtual copies, but instead of having separate files, they're all stored in the header. Also, because they're stored in the header, if you were to take the file to another computer with Phocus, those options would be available to you at that point as well.
Okay, and then just to confirm, there's a few questions regarding when you import with FreeFR files. So yes. Once you've imported and they get automatically saved and converted as FFF files, do you still need to keep that FreeFR file?
No, because the new FFF files are effectively the converted 3FRs. So you're basically keeping 2 sets of the same things, and to be able to work on those 3FR files, you'd need to import them again. So once you've imported them and got your new master with all the other items added, you can delete the 3FR files. You don't need to keep them.
Okay, and then you also spoke about how Lightroom, you can import both the FreeFR and the FFF. Is there any difference at all? Is there a preferred option, or do you get the same result regardless of which version you import?
Again, because Lightroom struggles to read the full header data of the file, effectively, once you've got either of the two files in there, it will then work on them. Personally, I would say if you've imported the files into Phocus and created 3F files, you've got the full amount of correction data from the camera. So you've got the calibration files, you've got the gain adjustments and everything. You've got the full raw conversion done to the FFF. I would, and this is exactly what I do. I work on that FFF and then I add that to my Lightroom catalog, knowing that I've got the full Hasselblad raw conversion done. And then, yes, Lightroom or Photoshop will then say, oh, this is a Hasselblad raw file. This was the lens. This is the lens correction that I'll use. And if I want to work in that, it will allow me to do that. So out of preference, I would choose the FFF file to put into Lightroom. It's got more information from Hasselblad in it.
Okay, and then one last question from Raymond. Is it possible to move an image into Photoshop for further work and then have it saved back automatically for Phocus? Is there a workflow for that?
No, because while you're in Phocus, you're obviously working on the raw file, and because Photoshop can't access the stored raw corrections when you open it in Camera Raw, any work you do in Phocus is not accessible in Photoshop Camera Raw. And so then you'll be back to square one, you'll be changing that. Anything you do in Photoshop, when you then update the file and save it, you won't be able to write to the raw file. So you'll have to choose something else in terms of, or the corrections that you create in Photoshop or Lightroom effectively will be either in the catalog or an XML file. And so Phocus won't read that. So really it should be a linear from Phocus towards Photoshop is the best way to do it.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Chris. That brings us to the end of our first Phocus Q&A session. Yeah, hopefully it's been interesting and of help to people. As I say, we try to cover the popular suggestions that we had as part of your registrations. If we haven't covered your particular topic, please feel free to suggest it again next month. We'll try and keep it varied and cover as many topics as possible. So yeah, thank you very much, Chris. So just to finish off, I'll just go through my usual slides at the end here. So as you exit the webinar, a feedback survey will come up. If you could please take the time to fill that in for us, that's much appreciated. It helps us to know how we're doing and what you would like to see more of. So thanks in advance for doing that. And just again, another reminder that all our past webinars are on our Hasselblad YouTube channel. So please feel free to have a look on there for any other webinars we've hosted recently. And indeed, today's recording will be posted up either later today or worst case tomorrow morning. So be able to watch it back there. And then, of course, for anything for Hasselblad, go to hasselblad.com. We've got all our events and future webinars listed on there if you're interested in joining us again. Obviously, lots of information on our products, information on our partner network around the world, lots of inspirational stories from photographers that use our cameras, lots in our history, and you can, of course, request a demo and request any support that you may need on any products. So once again, thanks for joining us. Hopefully you'll join us again. Apologies also again for any sound issues at the beginning. And I hope you've enjoyed it and found it useful. And we look to welcome you to another webinar again soon. Thank you very much.